Well, thank you for checking back in with us today. Always a pleasure to have you here. You are listening to Red Eyes Radio. My name is Henrik, and if you've been following us this week, you know that it was a busy week. We did our live coverage of the Republican National Convention, and we're going to do more or less the same from the DNC, the Democratic one, in Philadelphia next week. And we'd love to get your help if you are in the area, so definitely reach out to us. If you're in the Philly area, redeyes@protonmail.com. That's the best way to get a hold of us. But don't miss the coverage. It'll be fun. We have Roger Devlin with us on the show today. He returns. He's been with us before to discuss his book, Sexual Utopia in Power, on the destructive forces of feminism in the West. But we are going to discuss a few other topics today. In the first hour, we are focusing on the myth of the multicultural utopia that arose in Spain after the Muslims violently invaded into the Iberian Peninsula. As you might know, the ivory tower liberals that are well shielded from the multiculturalism we have today have been pushing this lie in education, in media, and the arts that somehow a superior hybrid culture of amazing progress and beauty arose when the Muslim forces came into Europe and Spain and gave us cave-dwelling barbarians civilization itself. Well, the truth is that the gates were opened to the Muslim hordes, and my ancestors, the Goths, who were probably the second most advanced in Europe at the time, next to the Romans, were targeted by the Muslims, just like we are now again in the original homeland of the Goths in southwestern Sweden, with the recent developments in Nice and Munich that, by the way, hadn't yet transpired when we recorded this interview. It is getting painfully embarrassing for people who move in the official spheres of politics and news media to disagree that multiculturalism is a failed experiment. This is madness, and these are incompatible cultures and people that are being forced together. Even if it happens to be that a few people are okay and they don't have any problem living side by side, why is the supposed cultural enrichment that we are getting now worth playing Russian roulette with terrorism over? What is it that is so great from that we have to sacrifice the lives of European people? Well, keep that in the back of your mind as we discuss the history of this, how it related to Spain, as we take this into the modern world and discuss what is happening in Europe. Well, Roger Devlin, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you back again. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. Hope you're doing well and that you've been doing well since we last spoke on the show.
Hello, Henrik. Yes, I'm doing fine and glad to speak to you again. We saw each other at American Renaissance, I think, most recently in May.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. We spoke, actually it was a year ago on the show. It's remarkable how time has flown by. I thought it was just maybe 6 or 7 months ago, but there you go.
Yeah.
So
what was the date? Do you have the date of that show?
I think it was June, actually.
June. It was just when my book came out, Sexual Utopia in Power. Yeah.
Exactly. We wanted to plug that. We wanted to talk about the book, and I've been going through some more of it since that time as well. It's an excellent book, and I was actually going to see if we can tie some more of that into our discussion a bit later, or kind of put, I guess, the work and the knowledge that you have on the subject in context to some of the things we'll be talking about here today. But one of the things, Roger, that I wanted to begin discussing with you is actually an essay or a review that you wrote on Dario Fernandez Moreira's book on Moorish Spain and the myth of a multicultural paradise. We actually invited Dario, and unfortunately he declined for various reasons. But what was your impression of the book? And I think that this subject is so interesting because it gives us a history of an example of something that I feel is recurring in Europe right now.
Dario Fernandez Moreira is an American scholar of Cuban extraction who originally came to my attention, I think it must have been 20 years ago. He wrote a book called American Academia and the Survival of Marxist Ideas, and I read an article that was based on that, and so I always remembered his name. There are few enough non-leftist academics out there, and I think they're especially rare in the field of Spanish studies. But a couple of years ago, I heard he was coming out with this book. It was delayed a few times, but I pounced on it as soon as it became available. It's called the Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. Now, I should explain to your readers that there is a kind of a little academic industry, cottage industry, of academic books glorifying various non-Western civilizations and trying to paint them in the most positive light possible. And for some reason, Moorish Spain, Muslim Spain, between the 8th and the 15th centuries AD, has been chosen as one of these civilizations to compare favorably with the West. And it's somewhat difficult to see why it's been chosen. I think one of the causes may be the American writer Washington Irving, back in the early 19th century, wrote a sort of a romantic book of stories called Tales of the Alhambra, which sort of popularized a romantic image of medieval Spain, Moorish Spain. But anyway, it's really taken hold in the academy, and Dario Fernandez Moreira has written this wonderful volume refuting it point by point. Medieval Spain, Muslim Spain, was essentially like other early Muslim societies. It was very violent, it was very rigidly controlled, and Christians and Jews were only tolerated in the very narrowest sense of the word, in that they were allowed to live, but they weren't allowed to live their lives freely or worship freely, or they were subject to very heavy taxes just because they weren't Muslims. They were forbidden from worshiping in public. Christian churches couldn't ring their bells. Christians and Jews had to rise when a Muslim entered the room as a sign of respect, and Muslims generally treated non-Muslims like, as very much second-class beings. And so, and it was, yes, there was a bit of poetry, and there was a philosopher named Averroes who wrote some interesting commentaries on Aristotle. But and there was also some beautiful architecture, as any visitor to Cordoba or Granada can attest. But other than that, it was not a great period of cultural flourishing.
And that's true. I mean, Roger, that they've truly pushed this as something extraordinary in European history. I remember it was actually many years ago now, BBC4 released a series, a documentary series. I think it was 3 or 4 parts by Andrew Graham Dixon. Not sure if you're aware of him. That was called The Art of Spain, which was, it was a very well made documentary, but it went into this very aspect of kind of a romanticized, a rosy glassed view of what wonderful art could come out of a merging of these two cultures, basically, and without focusing anything really on what set the stage for this or the violence that made this possible. Exactly. So it's very much a myth around this period. You're absolutely right.
There's actually a book called The Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. And that's pretty well torn apart. The woman who wrote it, a certain Maria Rosa Menocal, is a lefty academic who doesn't even really have the specialized knowledge to do a book like this. But there are many other similar books. I'm looking at a list right now. A Vanished World, Medieval Spain's Golden Age of Enlightenment, and there are quite a few other titles like that. And it's all false. The Moors spread their religion by the sword. In 711, they crossed over from Africa, which they had just. It's important to remember that North Africa was Christian too before that.
Yeah.
And in this century after Muhammad's death, they took over all of North Africa, most of the Byzantine Empire, and in 711 they crossed to Spain, and they set about attacking the towns one by one, very often massacring the inhabitants or giving them the choice of the Quran or the sword. And within about 10 or 15 years, they had conquered almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. And of course, as I guess you know, they even went into France and conquered some towns in southern France, and
Yeah.
were not stopped until 732 at the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel.
Yeah, that's right. I've been very actually interested in the Visigoths because it has a connection to my homeland, Scandinavia.
Oh yes,
before
that's
the
right.
yeah
Let's back up a little. The Visigoths were one of the Germanic tribes that conquered the Roman Empire, and the Iberian Peninsula was ruled mostly by the Visigoths after the fall of Rome.
yeah that's right. They are believed to, well, their own stories relate that they migrated from southern Scandinavia, then down to a region in Poland, close to Prussia, and then eventually, as you say, down through interactions with Rome and kind of aiding in the conquering of them, and then they moved further to the west to Spain. But what I've heard there too is that there's quite a bit of myth making around them, that they were claimed to be less civilized, and these were, barbarian tribes and all this kind of things. But beyond Rome, in terms of the structure that they had architecturally, the road networks, it was actually the Visigothic Empire that was second in line after Rome in creating, civilization as far as we know it back then. And this is something that's actually been kept out of the history books too, that it was like they say, well, it was not until the Muslims moved in that they brought architecture and they did all these wonderful things.
Right.
And it's actually a lie, interestingly enough.
Yes, the Germanic tribes varied enormously in their level of civilization. Some of them were indeed rather backward. The ones that were closer to the borders of the Roman Empire and were subject to Roman influence became more civilized, and I think the Goths, the West and East Goths, were actually the most advanced of all the Germanic people.
Yeah.
And the Ostrogoths, as you know, took over Italy after the fall of Rome, and the Visigoths took over Spain. And yes, they did have it's sad that not more is known about it. They ruled Spain for about 300 years, and there were important writers, Latin writers of Visigothic ancestry, church leaders, theologians, and Dario Fernandez Moreira in the book lists some of these important people, even an authority on music. So it appears that the Visigothic kingdom had a fairly flourishing culture, certainly at the time more so than did, for example, Merovingian France or Anglo-Saxon England. And this was destroyed, by the Arab invasion of 711.
Let me add this too, Roger, because I think this is an interesting point, and I'm sure you're getting around to that. But what happened is that the Visigoths, obviously, they had a more a pagan religion, but eventually they converted to, I believe it was Arianism.
At first, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
and then they became
Arianism,
then Roman Catholic, right, or Roman Catholic. But what happened is that they were basically much in the same way that the Muslims did. They wanted the people who were living in their empire to convert, right? They wanted them to become Catholics as well, and so what happened is that the many of the Jews that were living in this area at that time were forced to convert. And this in itself seems to have sparked an incredible antagonism, because we can actually go today and read about the history of, when basically the city gates to many of these places were actually opened to the Muslim hordes, right? That there was a cooperation here between some of the Jews in the area who wanted to kind of revenge on the fact that they were forced to convert to Christianity. Is that a correct assessment?
Mm-hmm. I actually don't know about the forced conversions, but I know that there were rather harsh laws governing the Jews. It's important to understand that the modern idea of religious tolerance was just completely absent at this time. Nobody practiced religious toleration in the modern sense. The Christians didn't, the Muslims didn't, the Jews didn't. And so, yes, there was some rather harsh anti-Jewish legislation in Visigothic Spain, and the Jews decided to take a gamble on a change of masters, and collaborated with the Moorish invaders, and some Christian leaders also collaborated in order to be eaten last, and it worked temporarily. In the early days of Moorish Spain, the Jews were in somewhat of a favorable position, and some of the Christian collaborators too. But eventually, once they had secured their dominance, they mostly did away with this and trampled the rights of both Christians and Jews.
Yeah, remember, there's I'll add a link to it, folks, so you can actually read it for yourself. But there's a listing on one of the Jewish history websites which detail this from 711, July 19th, when Tariq ibn Ziyad defeated King Roderick, who was one of the last Visigothic kings. Yeah. And this was at the Battle of Rio Barbate, or however you pronounce that. And the Jews backed him in this battle. Then many cities consequently were conquered: Cordova, Toledo, Ramallah, and etc. And this was all the way up to 1741, I think, or something like that. So it took many years for them. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting lesson, Roger, in terms of putting this in context to what we're seeing happening today, because consequently Spain was obviously blamed for a tremendous amount of that they had somehow a particular hate both for Muslims and Jews in all the way back up in 1492, right, when they finally actually managed to kick out the Moors and kind of take their homeland back, right?
Right. According to Fernandez Morera, the Jews, the Visigothic laws against the Jews were very harsh, but once the Reconquest began, the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain were actually rather easygoing about the Jews, and in later years, in the later part of the history of Andalusia, Jews even fled to the north because it was better for them to be living under the Christians than under the Moors.
Oh, really?
At the time, that's like we're talking about the late Middle Ages. Then, of course, there was the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. So it varied from age to age.
Right. It's a long period here we're talking about. But one of the points that we never hear from history is that there was justification for these policies. There was a reasoning of why they were wary.
Yes.
Right? I mean.
Oh yes, certainly. Yeah. Yes, I mean Jews did play a role, I think, at the capture of Constantinople in 1453 in the same sort of way. Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, is there anything else? I mean, obviously, this is a huge topic of what happened and how long this occupation took and everything. But one of the things I'd like to get to is to putting this in context to today, that we seem to kind of lack this history. I mean, obviously, we're not talking about the same people. It's a different age today. But there is very much echoes of this coming to us today from this historical lesson that we are refusing to look at, when we have effectively opened the gates, or our elites have opened the gates to Islam once again in Europe. How do you view this from your perspective, Roger?
That's right. It's I do wish that some of the people. It seems that after 9/11, everybody in the West became an expert on Islam. Everybody started pronouncing judgment on what Islam was like, and without bothering to do much study in the first place. So I can promise you that the book by Fernandez Morera really tears to shreds the scholarship of other writers who celebrate Moorish Spain. It's a very thoroughly annotated book, and he catalogs exactly all of the exaggerations of Moorish cultural achievement. I think it's fair. I mean, he acknowledges that yes, the Alhambra of Granada is very beautiful, but it's important to remember that it was built with slave labor, and even much of the architecture was copied from styles that Christians had developed. probably the most appealing thing about Muslim civilization is its beautiful architecture, and it was mostly all taken from the Christian world because Islam is a desert religion. The original Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula didn't have much in the way of permanent dwelling structures.
Right.
And so,
Tents. Yeah.
yeah, Muslim architecture was borrowed with some changes from the Christian world, Christian basilicas of North Africa, and Fernandez Moreira goes into some detail about some of the specific borrowings.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about mathematics and science and philosophy, right? We hear that this is a flourishing age at this point, and it was basically, without this, Europe would have been still cave dwellers and not advanced at all, right?
Well, yes. Fernandez Moreira points out that the works of the Greek philosophers were never lost. They survived in the Greek Empire, the former Eastern Empire of Rome. And there were some Arab-speaking savants who studied them, but they studied them in Arabic translation. They were not apparently responsible for the transmission of the Greek manuscripts to Western Europe. Some of this history is a little obscure. It's not known in every detail what the history of the manuscripts is. In Spain, there was a single significant commentator on the works of Aristotle called Averroes or Ibn Rushd, and he was viewed with suspicion by a lot of people. In fact, there was a crackdown in Muslim Spain against the study of philosophy at one point. It became dangerous to know anything about Aristotle. Islam has always been much more anti-intellectual than Christianity.
That's interesting. You wrote, of course, how many parts was it? 2 parts review for the Occidental Observer, I believe, right, on this?
Yes, it was all written together for the Occidental Quarterly and then divided for publication on TOO.
That's right.
It's in the summer issue of Occidental Quarterly right now.
Yeah, it's a very good article. I definitely recommend people reading it and getting a different view and getting introduced to the book by Dario. Very, very interesting. Right. One of the things then we can discuss a bit here is the role of sexuality as it compares between the West and Islam, because as you know, Roger, we've had a tremendous amount of sexual attacks and rapes in Europe the last 2 years now, with an increase of the migrant influx, and of course even just previously of having this dream of a multicultural world forced and thrusted upon us. We have seen tremendous changes in sexuality. As you know, in Sweden, they've gone so far that they urge women not to go out at night in certain cities. Right. They are giving them bracelets that apparently are supposed to help to raise awareness about this. What's your view on this from your perspective in terms of what you write about when it comes to sexuality? Yeah,
it's very difficult for Westerners to understand the way Muslims think. We're sort of brought up from infancy on the idea of the plurality of cultural traditions, that different countries have their different ways. Muslims don't know anything about this. They're taught that women who don't wear veils are whores. And that's the definition of whore in that part of the world, an unveiled woman. When they come to Europe, they don't revise those ideas. They just assume that all European women are whores, and that's what they call them. To them, the Muslim way of viewing things appears natural. They're not even aware that it's a special set of beliefs. It just seems to them like self-evident that women without veils are whores, or that eating pork, for example, is a filthy, unspeakable practice. And they don't say, as we do, well, okay, this religion forbids pork and that one doesn't. They just think that there's something deeply wrong with Europeans for engaging in this abominable practice of eating pig meat. And they think that there's something wrong with European women because they don't go around wearing a Muslim veil. They're very they don't have the ability to stand back from their own culture and to see their beliefs as like a particular set of beliefs. As one author puts it, to a Muslim, Islam seems to be part of the logic of things. It seems to be part of the world. And so this essentially makes Muslims unassimilable. You know, most of them can't be taught. They've grown up believing this way, and they're going to go right on believing this way, even when they come to Europe. So the only sensible policy is to keep them out of Europe. And it's amazing that the European leaders, you know, Europeans are rationalists. You know, there are European leaders who are advocating things like teaching Muslim men not to rape.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah,
Classes. You know, Germany has and Norway too, by the way, anti-rape classes now.
Yeah. It's like, you know, teaching them the alphabet, you know, teaching them the language, teach them not to rape the women. You know, it's just, they view it as something that just needs to be taught.
Well,
and
because it's a different it's a different cultural expression, right, that they have, and so it's not their fault. It's just that they misunderstand us. I actually saw a Swedish politician and lady. She was tweeting a series of 2 tweets. I have it in the latest video that we did on the sexual bracelets or the don't grope bracelets. And she actually says that it's worse when Swedish men rape because they have been trained on this, but Muslims haven't. So therefore, it's not their fault. She actually says that. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm going to say something radical here. I think that she has a point, actually. Muslim societies are, you know, they're this strange view of women, a sort of a contemptuous view of women, is sort of written into their societies, and it does work in a society where everybody's a Muslim. The women all know what they have to do, and they don't have to, and so, you know, you don't really find ordinary Muslim girls being raped all the time. But it's something that's just utterly incompatible with our way of life, and we cannot think that we can just teach Muslims otherwise in the way that you teach somebody how to drive, or, you know, they, in fact, you know, they feel just as certain that their way is superior. They're wondering, what is it about Europeans that they don't get it, that unveiled women are whores and that women have to cover their faces? What's wrong with Europeans that they don't see that? To them, it just seems natural. They're not aware of it as a specific religious tradition that they happen to have inherited.
You know, I wonder how much they analyze and look at Europe and put things such as feminism in perspective, where they say, well, you know, white man or European, look at your society of where things are going, because you know, from their perspective, right? They have this idea that almost the women have to be kept in check to a certain extent, I can imagine. But in our society, it's the opposite, right?
Yes. Well, the way it used to be, of course, was that women in the West were expected to practice self-control. And of course, in the Islamic world, they really don't have to, because all the controls are from the outside. They have brothers and fathers and husbands always watching over them and making sure they don't step out of extremely narrow behavioral bounds. And so this is like a perfect storm when you put people like that together with feminists who teach women that they have a right to do exactly as they please and to expect men to behave in whatever way the women want, and so forth. Obviously, what we have to do is go back to the older European way of teaching women to be responsible, to take responsibility for their own actions, and to practice self-control.
Yeah, because what's happening right now is that we, in our way of life, is forced to adopt to their way of life. If we look at some of these examples in Germany, where, for example, at pools they have to set up you know, signs, don't touch and stuff like that. They're asking women to dress up and not wear miniskirts. I mean, So what's happening is that we have to just to the lowest common denominator. Yeah, to them, right? And so this is what happened. You even have another interesting allegiance, if you will, that's occurring here when we have people like Sadiq Khan, the first Muslim mayor of London now, who basically lines up with feminists when he says, let's not have this sexist advertisement in the subways anymore in London, right? And the feminists agree with him. Isn't that remarkable?
Yeah, right. Yes. Yes, and I think the feminists are probably going to be, it's not surprising to me that the feminists are the ones who are bending over backwards to try to accommodate the Muslims. It's only their own men that they hate, and it's their own men who I think have to get them back into line. If they can't control themselves, we're going to have to be more like Muslims and lay down the law for them.
Well, last time we spoke, Roger, you spoke about the responsibility of women from the sexual point of view, that they choose mates and therefore they hold a greater responsibility than men in society. So how do we solve the situation?
Well, ultimately, there's going to have to be a sea change in the behavior of Western women. I think it seems to me that the idea we have to go after is the idea that women have any right to sex on their own terms. A man doesn't have a right to sex on his own terms, and a woman doesn't either. And we're going to have to bring up our daughters to understand this. Yes, women are the traditional guardians or enforcers of monogamy, but if they can't even enforce it on themselves, how are they going to enforce it on men?
Right. Yeah, that's true. What about opening the borders in the way that we have? Do you agree that we can attribute this to an offshoot of feminism to a certain extent, that it's when women come into power in Western civilization, they tend to want to try to save maybe other people. They use their motherly instinct to a certain extent to extend a welcoming and opening their arms. Is that correct?
Yes, all those when Angela Merkel opened up the borders of Germany, you saw those groups of girls with signs saying "refugees welcome," and it was 9 times out of 10 girls and women who were holding up those signs. It is. It's a kind of an abuse of the maternal instinct, I think. Yeah. Of course, most of these guys do not look like the 3-year-old boy who drowned on the Turkish beach. They're they're healthy, strong young men. They really ought to be defending their own families in Syria and not coming to mooch off our welfare system.
Isn't that interesting?
But there's a feminine aspect to that. There's a feminine aspect to the opening of the borders. Yes. Yeah,
because you're right when you say it's. I find this very strange that so many of these men are taking off and leaving their mothers and sisters and wives, maybe if they have some, back home, and I wonder who does the fighting back in the homeland.
I believe some journalists have actually gone to Syria and interviewed the women, and they are not too happy with their men going off to Germany while they're having to face bombs and raise children by themselves. So these men are really, they're pretty. They're not the best kind of men, even from their own societies. They're irresponsible, and they have no business being in our country, certainly.
No, that's true. One of the other items here beyond the rape prevention classes that Norway have and parts of Germany too, they've also started with the pickup classes now to basically have an interaction between...
How to flirt.
Yeah, how to flirt and
how to flirt with German girls.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe you saw the website. The German government actually has a website on having sex with German women and how to do it or something like that.
That's correct.
As if they need instruction in that.
What is that about, though? I mean, it's almost like that they're seeking to. It's almost in a weird, strange, bizarre kind of way. It's almost like some kind of European-sponsored breeding program or something.
Yeah,
it's so bizarre. I mean, otherwise, why would they teach them how to pick up our women and do it right so that they can be like, coddled
Right.
into this sense of, well, okay, this is going to work out. This is great. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, do you follow developments in Sweden very much? I mean, are the Sweden Democrats going to put an end to this?
Well, we'll see if they do that. I don't think that they're hard-lined enough, to be honest.
What I hear about them is that they simply call for diminished immigration, less immigration. And what we really need to be talking about, of course, is repatriation. Because even if we closed off the border completely today, we would still have millions of Muslims having larger families than Europeans are doing. So,
right.
The hour is getting short. I mean, there's not that much time before removing kebab is going to require great bloodshed, and that's what I'm afraid of. If the current elites hold on for just a few more years, it's going to require a kind of race war to settle things out. It almost seems as if the current elites are steering us in the direction of a kind of race war.
Well, I agree. I think, to be honest, there is something to the edict order out of chaos, and I think our elites are using that to their advantage in this case, that they are, because look at the rhetoric. I don't want to go offline too much or off topic too much here, but there is a correlation to what's happening in, let's say, the United States with these shootings, both of police officers, but prior to that, how the media is using these shootings of African Americans, black men in the U.S.
Yeah,
and
right.
The way that they've ramped up the hatred in the media towards police officers, and then naturally, understandably, we're seeing a lash out against police officers, and there have been several that have been shot after that, and they refuse to take responsibility. It's almost the same situation, but different players in Europe, It
is, yeah. Because of their utopian beliefs, they do things that the media in both Europe and America are doing things that objectively are bound to end in tears, getting the blacks excited about the police officers and in Europe encouraging immigration. I am told that there has been something of a change in male behavior in Europe in the last month. I don't know if you've been over there to observe, but at least in Germany, after the business happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve, guys started accompanying their girls every place and not letting them go out alone. It's like men at this late hour are sort of rediscovering their masculinity and their natural protective role, and are stepping up and doing their job. If so, that's a wonderful thing. I'm glad that it's finally happening.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right on that too. I think that they realize the danger that exists now on your average street in Europe. At the same time, aren't supposedly these values of ours as progressive Westerners, of having our women be able to do anything in our society? Wasn't that one of the traits that we were so proud of? And now the establishment and the politicians are willing to backpedal on that just for the sake of having a multicultural society.
Yes, right. Yeah, it seems that when liberal values come up against the program of demographic replacement, it's the liberal values that lose out.
Yes.
Every time.
Yes.
The thing that really unites the so-called progressive left in Europe is a kind of animus toward their own people, toward white people. That's the thing that they never sacrifice. Very rarely will you see anyone demand that non-whites be required to maintain the same kind of liberal values as whites. So I think we're really getting a better look now at what the left is really about. It seems to be what's really at the bottom of it is a kind of hatred.
Yes, I believe you're right. I mean, ethnomasochism seems to be the highest virtue, and displacement the highest priority. That's what this has been about all along. And it's almost then that the feminist or feminism itself and even liberal values have been a kind of a not an end goal, but just a bridge, so that we can get from point A to point B, right?
Right. Just to soften us up, soften us up for our own replacement. That's the final goal. Yes, I have long predicted that the feminists would be in the forefront of making things easy for the Muslims, and so I feel myself vindicated. Kind of. I wish I weren't being vindicated, but I do feel like I got it right when I see Swedish feminists behaving the way they have been, and I guess you've seen pictures of girls holding up signs saying "We'll trade racists for rapists."
Oh yeah, definitely, exactly. Yeah, it's true.
So I guess those girls will eventually be taught a lesson by the Muslim invaders.
And even if they are, it seems that even at that point, they are unable to realize that this is a cultural value and not just kind of a rotten egg. I mean, of course, they're okay immigrants, they're okay Muslims, they're okay Arabs, or whatever. It's not. I mean, obviously, we're not going to judge everyone equally in that regard, but there's a cultural difference. As you say, our cultures are incompatible. And our values are very much incompatible, and they just lack that understanding. They think that these people that come into the West, they're going to become good little liberals while at the same time holding on to their beautiful culture and tradition, right? It's almost like they want to try to create this version of some kind of teddy bear that they can coddle that fulfills their sense of righteousness when they have allowed these people to come into our countries, right?
That's right, and the Muslims, Muhammad actually says in the Quran that a Muslim warrior fighting jihad, fighting for Islam, has the right to any women he can capture, even married women. That's in the Quran, so all Muslims believe it. It's as the writer, a good writer on Islam is Sergej Trifkovic, and he has made the point that nothing is really intrinsically good or bad in Islam. Good and bad depend entirely on what the Quran says or what Muhammad says. And so they do view a lot of them do actually consider themselves jihadists in Europe. And even those who don't, they view raping a non-Muslim woman as a rather venial sin, as rather a peccadillo. They would be horrified by the idea of raping a Muslim woman. But you see, to a Muslim, the moral community is Islam. There is no other moral community. There are no particular rules about how to treat people outside the Islamic community. So we're not covered by their moral law. It's very, very hard for Westerners to understand this mindset, but it runs very deep in them. It requires an effort of imagination, I think, for a European even to be able to see the world through Muslim eyes, and obviously most of our politicians have never done this.
And would you say that these values also vary depending on who the priesthood, the clergy happen to be that these people are in contact with? Meaning that
yes,
right.
They will get what is the word now? A fatwa, a decision from an imam, which is called a fatwa, to decide what is right or wrong to do. If they're unsure about something, they'll get a decision from a local imam, and two imams may come up with very different decisions. So, there are some things where the Quran and the traditions of Muhammad are very clear, but a lot of things on which they aren't, and so different Muslims will give you a different idea. Another point that Guillaume Fay has often made is that there are differences. There are certain racial and cultural differences among Muslims, like Islam originated, of course, on the Arabian Peninsula, and then it went out and conquered people who were rather more civilized. And to this day, you can see like higher standards among Persians than among Arabs. And
sure,
Turks also are sort of halfway Europeans, and racially they're almost Europeans, and they're on the whole, I think, not quite given to the narrow-minded kind of Islam that is typified by Saudi Arabia or ISIS.
So as you're describing this, it's almost then that a combination between the Quran and what many of these imams say, that in itself becomes a kind of an amalgamation of some kind of instruction manual to be followed. And so us in the West, with our individuality and our free will and free thinking and free thought and obviously clash with this very concept. We have tried to move ourselves, well, supposedly away from dogma and implementation of science and becoming objective and these kinds of issues, right? And that's, I think, one of the main problems why we have such a difficulty understanding each other, because the outlook on life is just so vastly different.
Yes. The Muslim religion is entirely authoritarian. It's you don't ask why the rules are one way rather than the other. You just follow the rules. For example, I'll give you an anecdote. Some years ago, this is an amazing story. There is, of course, a rule in Islam that women cannot go outside without their faces covered. In Saudi Arabia, an elementary school for girls caught fire, and the girls were running for their lives. And the Saudi policemen pushed them back into the burning building because they did not have their veils on.
Wow.
That is the way Muslims think about rule following. The Quran says it. There's absolutely no room for taking account of particular situations or anything. It's a totally authoritarian religion, and if a young Muslim wants to know why the rule is this way rather than another, he can be beaten until he accepts it. That's the way they teach, and that's the way they think. There's absolutely no individual reasoning or moral reasoning on their part. It's you follow the traditions to the letter.
Well, I think there's two things here then, Roger, that makes this, to go back to your earlier point of conflict and violence as an outcome of this cocktail that is brewing right now. We have, first of all, a belief, which I would say most people in the West, Europeans, don't really have today. We, as I said, we maybe go for the scientific route. Atheists, sure, certainly there are still Christians, but the belief is not as vehement and as unquestioning as it is in Islamic populations. So
in Christianity, there is nothing comparable to Sharia. Christianity, the big change, the way in which Christianity broke with Judaism was getting rid of the legal code, and elevating the idea of conscience. And there is no pattern of behavior. Whereas Muslims have rules about how to blow their nose, how to cut their hair. How
to wipe their behind, I've heard even.
Yes, exactly.
With what hand? Right.
Yes. There's no difference to them between a rule governing, say, marriage and a rule governing, personal hygiene. They're all just Islamic rules. They're part of the law. Islam tells you what to do, and in big ways and in small.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, okay, so back to my point there. The first point is that they feel then that they have kind of a divine support behind them. I think this has made many different tribes and people in the past much better fighters to a certain extent, because they feel that they have the God or the gods on their side, and this makes them kind of almost a supernatural kind of strength that arises in that. That's the first thing. And then the second is also that they work together, and people who work together will always almost be stronger than those who are few and outnumbered, and there are exceptions to that rule. But what this means is that this will be very difficult for us to to try to deal with the situation like this in Europe? If demographics continue, if the borders remain open, and we eventually become minorities in our own countries, Roger. I mean, that would spell a disaster for us on a life and death level, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, what Muhammad did historically was he united the Arab tribes. The Arab tribes had been fighting one another for, since the dawn of history. And Muhammad gave this set of rules to them and united them behind that and behind the idea of monotheism. And they redirected all of their energies outward to fighting their neighbors. And so within 100 years of his death, they had, they were gravely threatening Europe. And yes, they worked together. They worked together the way Jews work together, but in a way that seems very alien to individualistic Northern Europeans. It's another. That's one respect in which we could really learn from Muslims and Jews. Europeans, conscious Europeans need to start working together, because otherwise we're going to be picked off one by these various other tribes hostile to us.
Well, we bicker at what color rim the newsletter should have for our little organization, and we have a fallout over that.
Yeah. Right.
We got to get over that. We got to figure out what is happening here and do something about it, because otherwise, existentially, we are threatened. Western civilization is I don't know if you would agree with that, but if it's more threatened now than it ever has been, what do you think?
Probably so, or certainly since the 1680s, the last siege of Vienna. Yeah, now they're not outside the gates; they're within the gates. It is an amazing opportunity to live some history for the generation coming of age now, because they're the ones who are going to be decisive. If they don't preserve our civilization is not going to be preserved. We do live in exciting times, and in a certain way, that is a blessing. There's so much work to be done, so there's absolutely no reason to be disheartened now. So many people get down in the dumps, but the reason our situation is so bad is that we've only barely begun to awaken and to fight back. But within the last year, we've had an awful lot of evidence that is happening. The departure of Britain from the European Union is a positive sign. The rise of the AfD in Germany and the Freedom Party in Austria. All of these, and of course the Trump movement here in the U.S., all of these are very positive signs, and I think that the globalists' regularly scheduled programming is going to be severely interrupted in the years to come.
Oh yeah.
So there's no reason for anybody, no reason for any young person especially to feel disheartened. I think that things are now beginning to move in our direction, and we're going to learn to cooperate with each other as white people, as sons of the West, because we have to. And a lot of victories are grasped from the jaws of defeat, and I think it might really happen in the coming generation in America and Europe.
Well, thank you for that. That's a really good point, and it's important to let people know that there's great opportunity in this danger that we face, and also that, as you say, we have been complacent in the past. We have let things go. We've become decadent, and this is really a chance for reform, if you will, like we've never seen before. And as you say, even men are, despite the fact that they've been feminized by liberalism and feminism overall, they are regaining their masculinity, getting in touch with their identity again. And if nothing else, this is painting us into a corner where we are going to be forced to do these things. Yes.
Right, exactly so.
What other recommendations would you have, let's say let's assume we have someone listening who's more of an enemy than a friend, if you will, if they've listened this far. and they don't understand this dilemma or what we are trying to communicate here in terms of what we are facing. What would you say to them to help awaken them or open their eyes, to make them understand that our concerns are legitimate, and if if we go, the whole ship might go eventually. What would you say to them?
Right. I would say take a look at just the demographic statistics. It's something that the mainstream media doesn't want to report on, but I think every nation in Europe now has sub-replacement fertility, at least for the native populations, and America is getting down to sub. We're just about at replacement now. And all the fertile countries are in Black Africa and the Muslim world. So we're facing a real demographic crisis. And if looking at studying those numbers a little bit doesn't affect you, then I guess you're probably beyond hope.
Well, there's actually one follow up to that. What about the self-hatred that they feel? Would you say that that's something that has been imposed upon them?
Well, the cure for that is education. You see, I was educated in the works of our tradition, in the philosophy and literature of Europe, and you can't tell me that that Black Africans and Muslims have something comparable. They don't. I know too much to fall for that, but of course, young people who are still in school don't know that. So, yeah, in a way, one of the things we're being called upon to do is undergo a kind of a program of self-improvement, and for men that involves regaining their masculinity, and for everybody that involves a certain amount of relearning or retooling in our own tradition. A kind of self-education. I think in the future, my friend Richard Spencer is going to be taking his website more in an educational direction rather than just commenting on the news, suggesting readings and even giving some little courses like on the basics of demographics and race and so on, so forth and so on. But that's another challenge, yes, to fight, to educate ourselves. The Chinese philosopher Confucius said to lead an uneducated army into battle is to throw it away. You have to know what it is you're fighting for, and that involves a certain effort of education.
Okay, last question on that. Would you say that the Muslims, especially those who are in the West, know what they're fighting for?
Well, yes. I mean, they are. It's difficult for me to generalize. Some Muslims are perfunctory Muslims, like Christians who only go to church at Christmas and Easter. But many of them are very committed to their faith, and they do know what the Quran says and what the traditions of the Prophet says. And if we're to be able to defeat them, we're going to need to know a little bit about their traditions that we're fighting, and even more about our own.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I hope it doesn't come to any of this. To be honest, I hope that this can be done amicably and peacefully, and that we can decide that. Oh, wait a minute! After years of having the globalists trying to force us together, because that's all this is. It's not. They haven't overpowered us and then consequently been, ran into our countries, if you will. This has been done to us, and in the same regard, and that should be pointed out, that in the same way, the globalists have bombed many of their countries, which have incentivized them to, of course, get out of those countries, right? So they're using both of these sides against us, obviously. So I hope it wouldn't come to that. But despite that, though, having said that, we can't just allow ourselves to be displaced and not give up, or not set up a fight here, if you will, and just
Exactly. Kevin McDonald said this years ago, that white people are, of course, they're going to fight eventually. It's frustrated all of us how long it has taken, but if we don't, we'd be the first people in history who just sort of let themselves be overrun without a fight. So the fight is starting just within the last few months. Certainly with the Trump campaign here in America, you can see the beginnings of a movement that's much larger than just Trump himself.
Well, Roger, I think
it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I think actually in the second segment here, I want to talk more about America. We spent the first segment here really talking about Europe, but the shootings, Dallas, the rhetoric now in the media, Trump, all these kinds of issues is something I'm going to talk more about with you in the second segment. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about some of the things that you have upcoming, because you're both coming to Sweden. You're going to be at the NPI event later in November. You're also writing a book on the Second World War, so you're keeping busy. Tell us what's going on.
Yes, I'm quite busy. I'm going to be going to Europe in the company of Greg Johnson in the fall. We're going to be at the London Forum in late September, and then we may be speaking in Belgium. That's something that hasn't been worked out yet, but we'll make it known at the proper time. And then on October 1st, I'll be at the Identitaire Idé conference in Stockholm that's organized by Arctos and Motpol. And I'm very excited about meeting Swedish nationalists. Sweden has one of the most interesting nationalist movements, I think, in Europe. Maybe because things have gotten so bad there.
Yeah.
In November, I will be addressing the National Policy Institute conference at the Reagan Building in Washington, D.C., so maybe I'll be able to meet some Red Ice listeners there. November 19th, I believe it is. And as for the book I'm doing, I'm a translator. I do a lot of writing and reviews, but a lot of my bread and butter comes from translating from the French and German. And I'm doing a very interesting book that came out in French in the early 1960s. It's called The Volunteers, and it's the story of the French Volunteer Legion, men who volunteered to fight on the Eastern Front alongside the Wehrmacht, Frenchmen, who left relatively easy lives in France to fight the Red Army and the partisans. And it's a fascinating story. It's a long book, 500 pages in the original French, and I expect to finish up the translation this week, and hopefully Greg Johnson at Countercurrents will be able to get it out by the end of the year. It's The Volunteers by Saint-Loup, as he calls himself, or Marc Augier, who was himself a member of the French Volunteer Legion.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about it when it comes out. It's very interesting. So you've gotten into the some of the Second World War and interest in that too, and history. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. A lot to look into there, of course, as always. Yeah, no, but that's great. We're going to have some links up then too, by the way, in terms of your engagement there to NPI. And also, do let us know, Roger, if there's any links you want us to add to any of the events that you have in Europe, and we'd be happy to add those too on the program page,
All right, will do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Roger. Stay tuned, everybody. We're going to take a short break here, and then we'll be back with the second segment. We'll speak to you after the break. Second hour coming right up with Roger Devlin as we shift focus and discuss Trump, the American elections, the recent police shootings in Dallas, and much more, with focus on the changing American political climate of radicalization. Dramatic changes is happening in the country, and it's been very intense in just the last year. So the question is, where will this lead? We discuss this and also his upcoming book on World War II. Don't miss the second hour as we continue. RedIceMembers.com. That's for our subscribers, our fans, our members, our supporters. If you're not yet a member, definitely do sign up for a membership with us and help support independent media. We have over 1,000 shows, videos, insights, Weekend Warrior, films, 314 shows, and more. We also have RSS feeds of everything, all previous shows, so it's super easy to download the shows you want and get them to your mobile device with a podcast app or a podcatcher. Also, upcoming, we have Germar Rudolph, Gilad Atzmon, John Lash, and Colin Flaherty, to name a few. But stay tuned, more coming up with Roger Devlin in the second hour. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be right back.